Good morning everyone, and welcome to Gilbert White's house in Selborne, Hampshire, the beginning of a whole day full of events to mark the 300th birthday of the Reverend Gilbert White, who lived here for such a long time. My name is Philip Geddes and I'm a trustee of the museum, and I'm going to try and guide you through a little bit of what's going to happen today so that you can get a feeling of what events you'd like to join in, what events appeal to you or not. We've got an absolutely packed day, and there are talks and lectures going on between now and about 7 o'clock in the evening. Today, as I said earlier, is Gilbert White's 300th birthday. So why does it matter? Well, we were hoping on his 300th birthday to have a great big party in the grounds here with lots of people, with balloons, with entertainment, with music. But that, of course, has proved impossible with the virus. So instead, we're having this online event. But why does Gilbert White matter? He matters because he's the man who really started us opening our eyes to nature and listening with our ears to nature all around us. And he did that for 40 years, living here in Selborne. Most people at Gilbert White's time studied natural history in the form of dead bodies on tables which they dissected. Gilbert was much more interested in what those animals did when they were alive and in their environment. So in the course of walking all around this area, he kept on asking himself, why is this? What's happening here? Let me observe this. Let me take a note of this. And it's that ability to observe very closely, he called it observing narrowly, that makes Gilbert White's work so important. Because he would look very closely into the different species and see how they behaved and ask himself questions about what they were doing and why they were doing it. That makes him a very important person because he is, in a sense, one of the fathers of natural history and of ecology. The other thing that I think is very important is that Gilbert then put a lot of this information into practical knowledge. He was a great gardener, for example, and he experimented a great deal in horticulture. Extraordinary as it may seem, the potato was introduced to Britain in 1580, but most people weren't eating them by the 18th century. Gilbert was one of the first people to grow potatoes in this area, and people then realized that the potato was a very good food. The 18th century, they loved melons, and Gilbert absolutely adored his melons. The problem was that growing a melon in England isn't easy because the climate isn't warm enough. So Gilbert came up with a very ingenious way of solving this problem. He built frames, and then he put a whole load of muck and straw in those frames and planted the seeds in them. What this happened was that as the muck rotted, it gave off heat, and the heat made the melon seeds give off large numbers of melons. And so in 1 month, he reports he managed to harvest over 200 melons. Absolutely extraordinary. So Gilbert is a very practical man in his approach to nature because he and all the people who lived in this village lived off the land and lived off the food that they grew around here. Very little food was imported from around the world, and of course there were no supermarkets in his days. So if you wanted food, you grew it, or you made friends with other people who grew it. Crucially, the real reason why Gilbert White is worth celebrating is that he's an individual who understood that mankind lived in its environment. He was a man in harmony with nature. So therefore, everything that you did as an individual, you would have an impact on how nature responded and how nature worked. So for example, in the hangar over there, in the distance, at one stage Gilbert said, you can't just go cutting trees freely, you've got to cut them only so that they can replace themselves and replenish themselves. In other words, a very modern environmental concept of renewable farming. He was also a person who believed that everyone was individually responsible for what they did. And if there's one really valuable message that comes out of Gilbert in this, his 300th year, it is that he was a man who understood that humans were part of the environment and were responsible for the quality of that environment. And if that isn't an important message today, I don't know what is. We've got a fascinating programme lined up for you today, something for almost everyone and all age groups. We're starting off with the Horton Fringe Theatre, who have produced a short little play that they're going to perform for us based on the life and writings of Gilbert White. The lovely thing about Gilbert is that aside from his famous book, The Natural History of Selborne, he was the most prolific letter writer possibly of the whole 18th century. We have thousands and thousands of his letters. They're all very chatty, good fun and very informative, and so that's going to lean very much on that. At 10 o'clock, our collections manager, Kimberly James, is going to take you on a tour of Gilbert White's house and show you some of the gems, including letters, that are not normally on display. We do have lots of stuff we can't show. At 10:45, we're going to have a happy birthday from Selborne School. The local school, which is literally just over the wall from here, has very kindly been putting together a whole load of pictures and images to celebrate Gilbert White's 300th birthday. At 11 o'clock, the writer and conservationist Laurence from the RSPB is going to look at why Gilbert is so contemporary by comparing his approach and his writing about nature with modern examples. And it is interesting, it's the thing I always find when I read Gilbert, all of a sudden he comes out with a line which could have been uttered by almost anyone today, and he just has a very quick native wit and a very easy way of speaking, so that's going to be an introduction to that. At 12 o'clock, we're going to talk about one of the unsung heroines of Gilbert White's story, which is his niece, Molly White. There is in the museum a most lovely picture of Molly White. She's a very cheerful, pretty, attractive and vivacious lady, and she was one of his many, many nephews and nieces. He had over 40 nephews and nieces, and Molly played an important role in putting together his book, The Natural History of Selborne. 1800, that's 1 o'clock, to us old-fashioned people, the Honourable Treasurer of the Selborne Society, Sarah Hadland, will be talking about the society. Now, you may wonder what the Selborne Society is. The Selborne Society was created in the 19th century and was aimed at perpetuating the ideas of Gilbert White. And they did it in an interesting way. They bought a wood in West London, in Perivale, which is still open as a nature reserve, and you can still visit, and lots of schools go there. So Sarah's going to be telling us all about the history of that and answering questions on Zoom, not Twitter, Zoom in her case, afterwards. At 1:45, we've got a large number of supporters and friends of Gilbert White who are going to be sending little messages to the old boy on his birthday. So that will be quite fun. I haven't seen them all, but I'm sure they'll be wishing Gilbert lots of happy birthday returns. At 3 o'clock, we're going out into the gardens here where I'm sitting at the moment. David Standing, who was the gardener here for over 30 years, is going to tell us about all the research that he did to discover what Gilbert White's garden actually looked like. And the garden, as you see it today, is basically an 18th century garden, and it was David who supervised the operation that brought that into being. So that'll be a fascinating one. At 4 o'clock, the Chief Executive of the Northumberland Wildlife Trust, Mike Pratt, will be giving us a discursive talk, I think is probably the right word for it, about why Gilbert is such a good inspiration for life in COVID times. At 5 o'clock, a very good friend of the museum, Steph West, who works for the Natural History Museum, is giving us a very interesting talk on a little-known part of Gilbert White's life, which is Gilbert in London. Now, in fact, he quite frequently visited his family up in London. 5:50, Kathryn Bevis, who is the Hampshire poet for 2020, has been commissioned to write a poem in the celebration of Gilbert White's 300th anniversary. So that's at 5:50. At 6 o'clock, Tim Sparks from the Woodland Trust's Nature Calendars programme is going to be doing a comparison of the records kept by Gilbert White in the 18th century with modern records. Uniquely, we are able to look at parts of this garden around us and say we know exactly what grew there, what animals were living in that part in the 18th century because Gilbert White recorded it. And quite a lot of work has been done doing 20th century versions of exactly those same spots with modern recording implements. At 6:45, the Chair of Trustees of the museum, Professor Khalid Aziz, will be giving out a message of celebration for Gilbert White's 300th anniversary. And at 7 o'clock, TV's Monty Halls will be here to talk about, well, it was advertised as the links between Gilbert White and Charles Darwin, and it may be a talk that goes a little bit wider than that. I don't know, I haven't seen it yet. But there are clear links between Gilbert White and Charles Darwin. Darwin loved Gilbert White's book and made lots of notes on it, and Gilbert White's book does have in one of the letters a very clear passage which indicates that he understood the underlying theory of Charles Darwin's Origin of Species. But of course, Gilbert came at it from observation and Darwin came at it from scientific research. Then at 7:45, at the end of the day, the museum directors, Steve Green and Judith Bowles, will close the festival with a few words. And that just leaves me to the final point. If you enjoy today and you've got something out of it, we would love it if you could help us in some way or another. The most obvious way to help us is give us some money. At the moment, we are struggling to get through the effects of the virus. We're doing okay at the moment, but we will need money to help us run this museum through the winter months. So I hope you have an absolutely lovely day, and I personally am enormously looking forward to looking at some of the talks. So have a good day and happy birthday, Gilbert.